Hi, I'm Dan Heber, and this is the lecture video to accompany our material on feminist epistemology. And as you've already noticed, I'm presenting the material, or at least the lecture material and the additional resources, in a different way this time. At this point, I've already asked you to read. Hopefully, not ask you to read. I've already asked you to watch one of the additional resources. As I mentioned in the written portion of the module, I usually ask you to look at my video resources first before you go on to look at some of the additional resources. And again, I say look at, but some of those additional resources are audio in nature historically. In this case, I gave you that video, a rather dry video, just a guy talking over a PowerPoint presentation. So I do apologize for that, but it's very good information in that. I'm going to be making some references to material in that video in passing as I go along here. So if you haven't already watched that additional resource, please stop this lecture now, stop this lecture video now, and excuse me, and go back and make sure that you look at that additional resource first, because it does set the stage and it explains how a study, such as epistemology, is suspect to gender bias, and there's a tendency, among some people to think it's like, well, how can gender bias work its way into something so sort of arcane and philosophically obscure as epistemology? But it does, and in the video, it does a really good job of pointing out some of the history behind why that gender bias exists and how it creeps its way into these academic studies. And if gender bias can creep its way into things such as economics, primatology, embryology, well, it can work its way into philosophy just as easily, right? Philosophy is an academic discipline, not unlike those other academic disciplines, and so philosophy certainly isn't above gender bias in the way that was pointed out in that video of those other disciplines that I mentioned. So what I would like to do in this video is talk about the material from the textbook in a slightly different way than I have before, because something you might have noticed if you started the reading assignment already is that this section 6.6, is presented differently than some of the other material that we've discussed. So for example, think back to the material that we talked about with Plato and Aristotle and Locke and Berkeley and Kant and Hume. It was a lot of sort of John Chafee writing several paragraphs of explanation, and then there'd be this sort of very brief excerpt from something that Kant said or something that Hume said, and then several more paragraphs of explanation by John Chafee, and then another brief quotation from one of those other philosophers that we've been discussing. But that format is reversed in this section. If you look at section 6.6, here at the very beginning, you have a couple of paragraphs by John Chafee sort of setting the stage and introducing Alison Jaggar. But once he introduces Alison Jaggar, you just get a whole lot. I mean, everything with this little green bar there is a direct quotation from Alison Jaggar. So all of this is just one extended quotation from Alison Jaggar. Then you'll have a paragraph or two of John Chafee. And now right here, notice that we got that green bar. So all of this is an extended quotation from Alison Jaggar with another couple of paragraphs of explanation. And then beginning right here, again, we have an extended quotation from Alison Jaggar, a little bit of John Chafee, and then we're back into these very long extended excerpts from Alison Jaggar, and as a result, it's really difficult to sort of actually, then let me rephrase that. Not as a result. The reason for that is because it's difficult to single out these little brief quotations from Jaggar that sort of are exemplematic of what her argument is. You kind of have to take it in these large chunks, and thus it's really difficult just to sort of take a little snippet out of it and then offer an explanation of what that snippet is, which is why the author of your textbook edited it in this way, which is again the opposite of the way that he had edited the material for prior sections. And so what I'm going to do in this video is, rather than sort of go through line by line and work through a textual analysis with you, what I'm going to be doing is, I just have a couple of notes here for myself, is sort of break this material down into 3 segments, and I'll use some graphics in the video that sort of indicate as to which topics we're going to be addressing when. So the first part of this video, we're going to be addressing the question, why have emotions been ignored? And that's going to correspond to pages 359, which I'm at right here. This is page 359 through page 361. And then in the second part of this video, which I'm not going to make a separate video for this, I'm just going to make one video with these little heading cards. The second part of the video is going to be answering the question, what are emotions? And that's going to correspond to pages 362 to 365 of the text. And then the third part of this video is going to be dedicated to answering the question, why is this all important? Which corresponds to pages 366 and 367 from the reading. So let me just scroll back here to page 359. Emotions shape our understanding. That's the title that John Chafee gave to this section 6.6 from the text. And so we are looking at Alison Jaggar after our discussion of Immanuel Kant. So remember, Immanuel Kant, the name of his theory is transcendental idealism, but it had that other name, constructivism. And in many ways, Alison Jaggar is sort of falling into that same intellectual tradition, whereas Immanuel Kant argued that knowledge of the world, that our knowledge of the world, that reality itself, is a construction of the mind. Alison Jaggar sort of takes a page from Immanuel Kant there, and she argues that our knowledge of the world, that reality itself, is also a construction, but it's not a construction of the mind. It's a construction, at least in part. It is constructed by the emotions. So our knowledge is constructed by emotions, and reality itself is constructed by emotions. So that's going to be her thesis. So to defend that thesis, she has to offer up an explanation of, well, if emotions are that important, why have they been ignored? And the reason that they've been ignored, according to Jaggar, is because sexism, because of gender bias, because you'll have, in the history of philosophy, you think of the names, think of the philosophers that we've looked at up to this point. Plato, male. Aristotle, male. Descartes, male. Berkeley, male. Locke, male. Hume, male. Immanuel Kant, male. All these male names. And all of those males, even though they fall into different intellectual traditions, they have one thing in common. They emphasize reason, and they de-emphasize and either ignore emotions altogether, or if they do bother to mention emotions, they mention them disparagingly, as if there's something corrupted about them and something that needs to be sort of commanded by reason. And a lot of these opening paragraphs here are sort of devoted to the history of that, gender biased attitude. And again, that's more fully addressed in that in that external resource that I ask you to look at. So I'm going to scroll down here and just mention a couple of things from this from Jaggar's work, Love and Knowledge. So she addresses those sort of gendered blind spots about how we've had historically this division between reason and emotion. So we've had those sort of two spheres, and we've also have these spheres between the male and the female, and notice how those map onto one another historically. Not only have philosophers made this duality between reason and emotion, they take this sphere of reason and they impose on it that other sphere of maleness. And they take this sphere of emotion and they impose that other sphere of femaleness on top of it, to the point that men become defined, that males become defined as falling into the domain of reason, and females become defined as falling into that domain of emotion. And think about how oftentimes, even subconsciously, people will adopt that. Well, they don't often think of that as being gendered language, but it is. Think of how many times you hear people say, well, think with your heart, think with your head, not your heart. Don't be swayed by emotion. You're being too emotional. You want to use reason and rationality. You don't want to be swayed by all these sort of emotional concerns. But notice that once you realize that, that sort of sphere of reason has been imposed onto that sphere of, maleness, that the phrase, think with your head and not your heart, is really exemplifying this gender bias. It's saying, don't think the way a female thinks. Think the way a male thinks. And how do males think? They appeal to reason, they appeal to rationality. How do females think? Well, they're emotional, right? And so therefore, don't be emotional. That phrase, don't be emotional, is really saying don't be female. Now, of course, who is going to be likely to say that? Well, it's going to be males that are going to be likely to say that. And who have we been studying in the history of philosophy up to this point? Male name after male name after male name. And so what a lot of philosophers have pointed out, Alison Jaggar is just one of them, that you do end up with this biased attitude toward many things, and emotion is one of those things that there's been this biased attitude towards. So that helps to explain why philosophers have been so dismissive of emotion, because emotion has been associated with the female. And why should we take, the sphere of, what is female seriously? We will only want to be concerning ourselves with reason, which again has been superimposed onto that so-called male sphere. So there's all kinds of, lacking that results as a result of that. So that's the first part of this video, and that was pages, what did I say? Oh, I lost track of my notes here. Pages 359 to 361. So I'm going to scroll down here to page 362 of the PDF and answer the question, what are emotions? Jaggar is very adamant about this. She says that it is incorrect to think of emotions just as these things that you passively experience, that you're just a victim of your body, that you're a victim of these, chemicals that are going off in your system. She says that's the incorrect way to think about what an emotion is. And she gives us sort of three different ways to this, to understand the question of what an emotion is. First, emotions as intentional. And by intentional, philosophers don't mean on purpose. By intentional, philosophers mean directed towards something. And so think of the difference between fear and anxiety. Notice that you always have a fear of something. You can have a fear of spiders. This emotion that you're having is directed toward something. The reason you're experiencing this fear is because there's that spider in front of you. You can have a fear of flying, right? You can step into a car and not experience any fear at all, but you step into an airport, some people all of a sudden are, experiencing fear, and that the reason that they're experiencing that fear is that emotional response is directed toward something. So that's what we mean by intentionality. Whereas anxiety, somebody is having a fear response, but it's not directed towards something, right? And this is why it's so hard to calm people down that experience anxiety, because if somebody's just scared of a spider, well, just get rid of the spider, right? And now that response goes away. But part of the difficulty in dealing with anxiety is because it's not directed toward anything. You're having this fear response but that fear response isn't intentional. It's not directed towards something. So what Jaggar is doing is making clear that, emotions, part of what we mean by an emotion is that it has to be intentional. Again, it has to be directed towards something. She also says that emotions are social constructs. And again, here notice what she says in the blue highlighted passage. Mature human emotions can be seen neither as instinctive nor biologically determined, right? So again, you're not just some passive victim of an emotion. You're not just sitting there while this emotion is flowing over you. An emotion is a social construct. And then she goes on to give her argument for how emotions are socially constructed, which really makes sense in today's age whenever we talk about neurodivergent people who are unable to pick up on social cues. And because they're unable to pick up on social cues, they are seen as not being emotional, right? So they're in the same situation that somebody who is not neurodivergent, what is referred to as normies in the community, and you'll have somebody who's neurodivergent in that same situation. Both of them had a parent die, or both of them had a best friend die, or something like that, and they can be behaving very differently. And the reason, what Alison Jaggar is going to say is what explains that is that it demonstrates that an emotion is not just something that washes over you. An emotion is something that is socially constructed. And that if you're neurotypical, an NT, a normie, then as you grow up, you pick up on all these social signals. Oh, this is how you act at a funeral. This is how you act at a birthday party, right? This is how you act whenever your best friend is crying. And if you're neurotypical, you're picking up on all those social cues, which is informing your emotional response. But of course, if you're neurodivergent, you're not picking up on those social cues. And so you're going to be seen as unemotional because you haven't constructed the emotions. So that's something that Alison Jaggar emphasizes there. And the third thing she emphasizes about emotions is that they are active engagements. And I want to point out some of this Kantian language she uses. She says emotions then are wrongly seen as necessarily passive or involuntary responses to the world. Rather, they are ways in which we engage actively and even construct the world, right? That language is no accident, whereas Immanuel Kant says that we have these categories of the understanding, that it's reason itself that constructs reality. What Jaggar is saying is that no, it's not reason which is constructing reality, it's our emotions that are constructing reality. Again, this language that's sort of borrowed from Immanuel Kant. Just as observation directs, shapes, and partially defines emotions, so too emotion directs, shapes, and even partially defines observation. Right? Just as Immanuel Kant said that reason and observation are working in tandem. What Jaggar is pointing out is that emotion and observation are actually working in tandem. So our conceptual framework is as much, perhaps even more, defined by emotion as it is reason. And I think I'm getting ready. Yes, I've reached the third part of the video now. I'll put up a little placard somewhere to the answer of why is all this important, pages 366 to 367. Well, a lot of what Jaggars is after here is titled, is given away in that title, the myth of dispassionate investigation. There's this tendency to, be over-reliant on science. Well, science is objective, science is unbiased, right? And what Alison Jaggar does is point out, it's like, well, science is only objective and unbiased if you believe that it is, in fact, based on dispassionate reason. But of course, the problem is it's not based on dispassionate reason, because the very way human beings think in the first place is through are emotions. Emotion plays that epistemological role, and hence if you're going to be ignoring or disparaging the role that emotion has, which is what philosophers have done throughout 25 years of philosophical history, right? Well, then of course you're going to have the wrong conception of what constitutes the basis of knowledge. And it's to our advantage to have an increased understanding of what the basis of knowledge is. And as long as we're ignoring emotion, which is associated with half the population, right? As long as we're ignoring that and acting like it doesn't matter, we're always going to be limited in terms of what we're capable of understanding. So there's obviously a lot more a lot more nuance to those arguments that are in the text. So I encourage you to give the text a close reading itself. But I've already been going on for about 20 or so minutes now. So in keeping with the length of these other lecture videos, I'm gonna cut it off there, and I'm going to ask you to enjoy the rest of the day, and I'll see you in the next video.